Og de tilbageværende ude i caféen, I er velkommen til at trække ind og finde jer en plads, der hvor der er. Vi starter nu her. Jeg har bare lyst til at sige rigtig hjertelig velkommen til foredragsaften til Surprised by Joy her i Aarhus Valgmenighed. Mit navn er Hans Christian, og jeg er præst her i kirken. Og jeg har lyst til først og fremmest at sige velkommen til jer fra CKA. Det er virkelig dejligt, at I vil bruge vores sted her til at holde sådan et relevant foredrag her. Og så har jeg lyst til at byde jer velkommen. Velkommen til en aften, hvor det handler om historie. Om en ret fantastisk historie, om det med at gå og ændre livssyn. Det er ikke så mange, der gør det sådan lige pludselig. Men for dem, der gør, så det livssyn, de ender med, det i hvert fald i C.S. Lewis' tilfælde, det var ret fantastisk. Og jeg glæder mig til at høre Alister McGrath, special welcome. And så det sidste, jeg har lyst til at sige, det er, altså, jeg har glædet mig ekstremt meget. Faktisk har jeg glædet mig, siden jeg sad sammen med Emil i 2019, nybagt præst. Vi snakkede om, at han ville invitere Alister McGrath til Danmark, og jeg var sådan, hey, jeg er lige blevet præst i sådan en kirke. Det kunne være mega fedt, hvis vi kunne gøre det sammen. Så tak, Emil, fordi vi kunne det.
Menighedsfakultetet here in Aarhus. So in the Center for Christian Apologetics, we want to ask the hard and difficult questions about faith and about Christian faith. Questions like, is belief in God irrational? Does faith and science conflict? How can you believe in a loving God when there's so much suffering and pain in the world? Tonight we have invited one of the world's leading Christian intellectuals, Professor Alister McGrath, to give a talk on why the Oxford literature scholar C.S. Lewis, he found Christianity persuasive and attractive, and what we can learn from C.S. Lewis today. So I'm looking very much forward to your talk. But before we get to that, we have some practicalities we need to.
Yes. Det er jo vidunderligt at være vært sådan en kirke, så kender jeg til noget af det praktiske. Så, first of all, if you didn't understand my introduction, then you will have no problem with the main event, the lecture. Men hvis du havde lidt svært ved at forstå det engelske, Emil han kom med, eller mig, eller måske som Alister kommer med, hvis du har lidt svært ved lige at fange de teologiske pointer på et andet sprog end dansk, så har vi oversættelse i aften. Og det synes jeg bare, du skal gøre dig benyt dig af. Lige hernede bagerst i kirken, der har vi headsets, og vi har Ida Leibøl, som sidder og vil oversætte hele talen til dansk, og det er bare en mulighed, du skal benytte dig af. Du kan bare gå ned når som helst og tage et headset. Programmet, som Emil lige sagde, det er, at lige om lidt, så får Alister ordet, så vil der være foredrag, så vil der komme en pause, og efter det, så vil vi have Q&A, og det skal Emil nok fortælle en masse mere om. Jeg skal også gøre opmærksom på, at under hele arrangementet, så vil der blive videofilmet heroppe på scenen primært, og så lige 2 rækker ned, plus minus. Så hvis du har et problem med det, så vil jeg anbefale, at du sidder på de pladser, så vil jeg anbefale lige at få byttet med nogle af dem, der sidder lidt længere bagud. Der vil også blive taget billeder. Hvis du opdager, at der er en, der tager et billede, og du af en eller anden grund, og det er helt i orden, ikke har lyst til at ligesom blive for evigt til arrangementet, så skal du bare sige det til vedkommende. Yes. Så skal jeg sige, at hvis du er en af de få rygere tilbage i Danmark, så der er tilgivelse for alle, har jeg hørt. Og derudover så har vi et rygeområde lige herude, ud af sidedøren og ude i det område herude i dag. Hvis du har brug for at bruge et toilet, så er det lige ved siden af bogsalget. Og nu vi snakker bogsalget, vi har simpelthen fået ProRex på besøg, ProRex forlag, og de sælger i dag de nye C.S. Lewis oversættelser med 50 kroners rabat på hver eneste eksemplar. Du kan for eksempel få C.S. Lewis' egen historie, Overrasket af fryd, til 200 kroner. Du kan få Altmans biografi om C.S. Lewis, den kan du også få til 200 kroner derude. Og det bogsalg, det er åbent nu, det er åbent i pausen, og det er åbent til allersidst efter arrangementet. Jeg tror, det var det praktiske, jeg skulle sige. Tilbage til dig.
Yes, I'm going to switch to English so Alister McGrath understands his own introduction. So let me introduce Professor McGrath. McGrath is a former Andreas Ipsius Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. According to academicinfluence.com, he is currently the second most influential theologian in the world. A month ago, he was the most influential. I don't know, maybe they changed the algorithm, so sorry about that. He has published more than 50 books and hundreds of scientific articles. He has delivered the Gifford Lectures, published as A Fine-Tuned Universe, The Quest for God in Science and Theology. And he has published the widely cited 3-volume work, A Scientific Theology. The topic for tonight is not science and theology. If you want that topic, you have to go to Randers tomorrow night, where there will be another event where McGrath will give a talk on that. The topic for tonight is C.S. Lewis. Although Professor McGrath has never met C.S. Lewis in real life, he has experienced him as an intellectual mentor. I read that some years ago, he went through a project of reading everything C.S. Lewis has written in chronological order. And the result of that project you can read in the C.S. Lewis biography he has written, called C.S. Lewis Alive. Now, without further ado, I want to give the floor to you, Professor McGrath. Let's give an applause.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you also for asking me to come back to this beautiful part of Denmark. It's really good to be here. And tonight I'm talking about C.S. Lewis. I'm going to focus on his transition from atheism to Christianity, which I think you'll find very, very interesting. But of course, we're not limited to that. If you want to talk about anything else in the Q&A session afterwards, we can do that. But basically, this is really interesting. And what I want to do is try and give you a sense of who this man is, of the kind of thought processes that moved him from a very aggressive, very committed atheism as a young man to actually becoming a Christian apologist. And I also want to try and give you a sense of what he thinks about things. And I hope that you'll find this interesting. Lewis and I have one or two things in common. We were both born in Belfast. We both discovered Christianity at Oxford, which I think is a very important point. But Lewis, I have to say, is a much better writer than I am. So I do always feel I stand in his shadow. And I think that Lewis is something who I think really, if I can put it like this, is a witness to the ability of God to change people's minds. Lewis was very aggressively, very committed as an atheist by the age of about 16. And it's very interesting to see why he should have been an atheist. And I'll look at that in a moment. And then he won a scholarship to Oxford. But the problem was, of course, Lewis was born in the late 19th century, and of course you can begin to work out the First World War clearly intruded on his career, and certainly one of the things that happened to Lewis was his aspiration to study classics at Oxford was interrupted by the First World War, which of course reinforced his atheism, and I will be coming to that very soon. But one of the points I want to make is that Lewis actually was someone who, as a younger man, like so many people at that time, was damaged both physically, he was badly wounded, but also spiritually and intellectually by the First World War. And Lewis basically was an atheist for a number of reasons. One of them was he felt that science and religion were incompatible. Another was he felt that Christianity was a kind of myth, like, for example, ancient Greek myths, or indeed Nordic myths, and therefore was something that might be interesting, but was not true. But I think Lewis's experience in the Great War, the First World War, really was enormously important in kind of way moving him to a very convinced atheism. And Lewis's experience of the First World War really did reinforce his atheism. So what I want to do is try and explore with you some of the themes he develops in his writing. But let's begin by looking at a photograph. This is a beautiful photograph taken in May 1917 in University College, Oxford. This is the entire student population of that college in 1917. Why were there so few students? Answer, they were all conscripted into the army. Lewis stands there at the back. He's at the back on the right-hand side, and you can see him standing there. And I want you to imagine that you are looking inside Lewis's mind. What would he have been thinking? Would he have been thinking, 50 years from now, I will be one of the greatest Christian apologists ever? No. For a start, Lewis was a very dogmatic atheist at this point. And secondly, Lewis's primary concern, we know from his letters at this time, was, I am not going to survive going to fight in the British Army in France. He did not expect to survive, and indeed one of the most interesting letters he wrote to one of his friends was, there were 5 of us who trained for the army at Oxford, and I am the only one who came back. So basically we're looking at someone who did not expect even to survive the First World War, let alone develop a career after that point. But I think that's a very interesting photograph, because it reminds us of a hidden actor in the life of C.S. Lewis. Lewis was a very clear atheist, and I'll explain why that was in a moment. But things change. Things change unexpectedly. Things change radically. And it's all because of, as Lewis describes in Surprised by God, being taken aback, being taken by surprise by the presence of a God who he had thought to be absent. So we'll come to that in a moment. But let's move on now and look at Lewis's career. So we're looking at Lewis. We're looking at him for longer than I expected, but we're now moving on happily. And basically, Lewis, I think, was a really very interesting person. He returned to Oxford in 1919, again as an atheist, and began by studying classics. And then, unusually, Lewis followed this by a degree in English language and literature. Lewis, I have to tell you, was really clever. And you can tell this because Lewis did his degree in classics. He obtained first-class honors at both points in the assessment of that, and first-class honors in English language and literature, having done that 3-year degree in 1 year. So you can see that really Lewis is a very interesting person here. He went on to become tutor in English language and literature at Magdalen College, Oxford, and indeed remained in that role for nearly 30 years before finally moving to Cambridge. I'm an Oxford person, so we forgive Lewis for going to Cambridge. But anyway, and then finally he retired and died in Oxford in 1963. And as many of you will know, Lewis died on the same evening as John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas. And there is a picture of Lewis's building in Oxford. Lewis has an office in that building. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in Oxford. It's called the New Building in Magdalen College. And as you might expect, in Oxford, a new building means 1780. So let's go back to Lewis's atheism, because I think this is really interesting. Lewis was an atheist, and he was very clear about why he was an atheist. Number one, science had made religious belief irrelevant. Those of you who are scientists may say, look, can we just stop there? Because that seems to be rather an over-interpretation. It seems to be a very dramatic conclusion from very slight evidence. But actually, Lewis really did think this as a teenager. He was absolutely convinced that science had kind of way eroded any conceptual space that God had once occupied, eroded any plausibility in God. Science simply made God irrelevant and redundant. And then alongside that was this idea which he found in Freud. Many of you will know this, that religion was a wish fulfillment. I would like it to be like this. I need it to be like this, and therefore it's going to be like this. And Lewis basically said people invent God because they are inadequate, they cannot cope with uncertainty, with anxiety, with death, and therefore they invent God as a way of seeing them through. And then, of course, the First World War itself, because Lewis just saw this as being, in effect, the final nail in the coffin of God. If there is a God, why did the First World War happen? And again, let me remind you, Lewis was not simply a spectator of this conflict. Lewis was a participant, badly wounded, had to be invalided out of the British Army. Now, you'll probably recognize all of these arguments, and they were very real for Lewis. But as time went on, he began to realize that perhaps these were not quite as strong, not perhaps quite as convincing as he had once thought. And certainly what we find is Lewis, when he begins to return to Oxford and study things properly, that he begins to have misgivings about atheism. First of all, he begins to wonder, is science really as simple as I had thought? I'll come back to that. Secondly, he began to realize that, well, maybe Freud is right. We are all prone, we're all liable to believe in things we would like to be true. But isn't that true of atheism as well as Christianity? And for Lewis, that becomes a major concern. Maybe I did not want there to be a God. Maybe I wanted there to be a world in which there was no God, because then I could do precisely as I wanted. So Lewis began to realize maybe there was a danger, not so much that he'd invented God, but that he'd invented atheism. And then thirdly, he began to have misgivings of his analysis of the First World War. He saw this as a self-evident indication of the plausibility of atheism. But if there is no God, then how do we explain the First World War? Well, the answer is it is human beings. It is human beings fighting each other. It is human beings bringing about mass destruction and dereliction on a scale never seen before. And Lewis began to realize that if he was to be an intelligent and consistent atheist, then in effect, the critique he directed against God had to be directed against human beings. Let's look at some of these concerns that Lewis had. This is his concern about suffering. I'm going to read it to you, then I'm going to explain what he's getting at here. This is a well-known quote which many of you will come across, but it needs to be explained. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea that it was, this idea of what is just and what is unjust? A man does not call a line crooked, that means bent, unless he's got some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And the point that Lewis is making is that really he began to realize he had an intuition. This wasn't the way things should be. But it wasn't something he could defend rationally. And if he could defend it rationally, it was that there is this absolute transcendent standard called justice. And the First World War did not conform to that. But where did he get that from? And Lewis began to realize that actually this didn't really make intellectual sense. In effect, in critiquing God, he presupposed God. So it's a very interesting point. But more importantly, I think, is this point. As I mentioned in the slide I showed you a moment ago, in the 1920s, Lewis really began to think, well, look, atheism is probably right, but it is not really very interesting. It doesn't do anything for me. And interesting, as many of you will know, Lewis reached this conclusion because of his growing interest in the imagination, in the emotions. In other words, to be a proper human being is not simply to think, it is to feel, it is to experience, it is to imagine a broader vision of reality. And Lewis began to realize that actually his atheism really cut him off from a very important part of human experience. He said that there are two sides to my existence. On the one side, a many-islanded sea. of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. So Lewis is beginning to think, atheism is probably right, but it's grim and it's meaningless. It doesn't give me something exciting to really give me a vision of who I am, of what life is all about. So it didn't really move him towards Christianity, but it just made him feel this isn't a good place to be. I need to find something better. So Lewis, as I'm sure you will know, moved away from atheism. And you'll find his description of how that happened in Surprised by Joy. And Lewis makes it absolutely clear, I did not want to be a Christian. But in effect, the evidence, all the weight of the arguments I was considering pointed me in that direction. And interestingly, Lewis very often points to the people, or the kind of people, who helped him to realize this. And many of those writers are not modern-day apologists. They are, in effect, people like Dante. They're people like George Herbert, an English poet of the 17th century. And Lewis says, look, these people, they were Christians, but they seem to have a much richer vision of life than I did. And we see here something really begin to challenge Lewis. And that is, it's not enough really to have this sense of rationality. There are good reasons for thinking this. It's about, if this is true, is this a life worth living? It's, if this is true, does it give me a vision of what life is all about, who I am, and the difference I can make? And Lewis found himself puzzled, because the writers who seemed to do this best were Christians. And Lewis felt Christianity was wrong. And gradually, Lewis began to change his mind. Lewis himself tells us he really came to faith in 1929. In my biography, I suggest maybe a year later, but it's not important. What we see really is Lewis changing his mind. And this is very important, because the point I'm going to make is this. Lewis was an atheist who knew why he was an atheist. Then he converted to Christianity. And if you like, he was an atheist who knew what it was like to be an atheist, what it felt like, the kind of arguments you find convincing. Then he moves and becomes a Christian. And in effect, he now knows the arguments that convinced him, and also what he now thought of the arguments that brought him to atheism in the first place. And if you read Lewis's writings very carefully, one of the things you will see is Lewis beginning to realize, maybe there is a place for me. Maybe there's a role that I can play as an atheist who became a Christian and knew why he did it. And so we see Lewis becoming an apologist in the late 1930s. Now, I think that's very important, because Lewis really took that role on because, A, he felt he could do it, but B, others told him he ought to do it. And if you want a single work which I think illustrates this point, look at The Problem of Pain. Published in 1940, Lewis was asked to write that work. And he was asked to write that work because the editor of a series for a British publisher thought, this guy Lewis knows how to write, and he used to be an atheist, is now a Christian, and could help us think this whole question of suffering through. So really, Lewis is giving us an understanding of what the Christian faith is all about. And what I'm going to do now is open up three major themes in Lewis's writings and explore them and try and give you a sense of what Lewis found so exciting about Christianity. And these are probably very familiar to all of you, but if not, there are things you'll really enjoy engaging. First of all, the idea that Christianity is a big picture of life. In other words, it's not just Christianity says A and B and C. It's much more Christianity gives you this rich, this textured, this profound vision of what life is all about, and A and B and C are in there. But the key point is they're interconnected in a broader vision of reality. Secondly, the role of stories. And thirdly, the place of imagination and reason. Let's look at the first of these. Now here I need to confess a personal interest. I was an atheist myself. Like Lewis, I grew up in Belfast. I was a very aggressive atheist and discovered Christianity at Oxford and began to ask my friends lots of difficult questions. And my friends found these troublesome. And eventually one of them said to me, "Oh, for goodness sake, why don't you read C.S. Lewis?" Now, I have to tell you that actually at this stage I hadn't really heard very much about C.S. Lewis. I knew he'd written a book about wardrobes, but I wasn't quite sure what that was. I do not. Anyway, I went and bought this book by C.S. Lewis. It's called They Asked for a Paper. And Lewis really gave me this vision of what Christianity was all about. And I suddenly realized this is exciting. Not just right, it's exciting. And you know, I keep coming back to Lewis because that's still the way I feel to this day. And it's all due to Lewis. So let's look at this key theme. Christianity is not a set of individual beliefs. I mean, it is that, but it's much more than that. It's about something that emerges from weaving these threads together and seeing something bigger, something exciting, which results from that. And this is a quote from Austin Farrer. Now, many of you will know who Austin Farrer was, but if not, Farrer was an Oxford colleague of Lewis who knew him very well. He was the witness at C.S. Lewis's marriage to Joy Gresham. And Farrer was a philosopher of religion. He writes these words: "Lewis makes us think we're listening to an argument, when in reality we're presented with a vision, and it's the vision that carries conviction." And Lewis, if you like, one of the reasons I think why he's been so successful as an apologist is he doesn't just say, here's an argument for Christianity. It's much more, here is what it's all about. Here's this vision, this way of seeing things. Would you like to step inside this and begin to get a sense of the difference that it makes, the way in which it makes sense of things, the way in which it gives you a sense of who you are and why you matter? And Farrer really identified this major theme as being integral to who Lewis was. But this is the signature quotation, which many of you will know. This is from the conclusion of Lewis's lecture at Oxford called, "Is Theology Poetry?" If you want to know the answer to that question, it all depends what you mean by theology. It all depends what you mean by poetry. But this is the conclusion, and it is, I think, a standout quote. "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." So let's do a little mental experiment. I want you to imagine you are standing on a hilltop or a mountaintop, and it's dark. And the sun will be coming up shortly, but at the moment you're looking down from the top of the mountain. It is dark. The landscape is shrouded in mist and shadow, and then the sun rises, and as it rises, the shadows begin to disappear. The mist begins to burn off. You begin to see things as they really are, not with complete clarity. There's always some mist and shadows remaining. But for Lewis, that's what Christianity does. It gives you a quality of vision of life, which really is transformative. You feel, I know what it's all about. I can step into it and really become part of this vision. So that really is a theme that lay behind my own encounter with Lewis back in 1974. Lewis was absolutely clear that Christianity offers us a connected and coherent account of the world that lets us work out how we fit into it. Those of you who enjoy reading Mere Christianity will recognize this theme. If you look at Mere Christianity, it isn't really a defense of individual Christian beliefs. It's much more, here is this bigger picture. It explains things like, for example, why do we long for something of supreme importance when what we find in the world never seems to satisfy us at all. And Lewis makes the point Christianity is able to engage this. So I think this is a very important aspect of Christianity. And of course, it immediately moves from apologetics to spirituality, because Lewis, in effect, invites us to see Christianity as giving us this spiritual way of looking at the world, which means it's inhabitable. We can position ourselves there, it makes sense of things, and it means we can live there and act within it meaningfully. And for Lewis himself, that was a really important point. But another point that's really important for Lewis is the role of stories. Now, Lewis realized the importance of stories long before he became a Christian. He loved reading childhood stories back in Belfast in the early 20th century. He read, for example, The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin. Those of you who've read this will perhaps be puzzled by that. But the point is that Lewis just felt it captured his imagination. But more than that, it showed how stories were able to open up things in a very deep way. And Lewis really felt that atheism was simply a set of ideas. It didn't use stories. And then, as many of you will know, Lewis had this very interesting conversation with probably his best friend in September 1930. Most of you will know the story. If you don't, when I mention the name of Lewis's best friend, you'll begin to see how all this hangs together. Because Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien had a long walk together talking about the role of stories in making sense of our world, and above all, the idea that Christianity tells a narrative, a story, which makes sense in itself and makes sense of every other story we tell. And Tolkien, in effect, opened Lewis's mind to realizing that Christianity was not a set of ideas, but a vision based on a set of stories. And that was really important, because immediately Lewis began to realize you could use stories as a way of talking about faith, and stories as a way of presenting faith. And of course, you probably know this, but if you look at Lewis's diaries from the late 1920s, Lewis and Tolkien are meeting every Monday morning to talk about their literary ideas. And one of the ideas they're talking about became the Lord of the Rings. So you need to realize Lewis actually played that very important role of being a midwife to that story, because as Tolkien himself said many years later, for many, many years, The Lord of the Rings had one reader, C.S. Lewis, and Lewis did me the service of encouraging me. This is worthwhile. Keep going. You know, we all need friends like that. I'm sure you'll agree. But the key point here is that Tolkien and Lewis, between them, recognized how important stories are. Christianity tells a story, and it's a fascinating story, but it's a story that makes sense of who we are and why we tell stories in the first place. And for Lewis, that was so important. Stories capture the imagination, and they convey information. Now, if I was lecturing to you about J.R.R. Tolkien, I'd be talking about The Lord of the Rings. I'm talking about C.S. Lewis. I want to talk to you about the Chronicles of Narnia and why those are so important, and again, how these cast light on why Lewis moved from atheism to Christianity. And again, the point I want to make is Lewis, for several years, thought, well, maybe atheism's right, but it doesn't excite me, it doesn't do anything for me, it doesn't tell stories. Whereas Christianity does. And that conversation with Tolkien really changed his outlook altogether. Let's look at the Chronicles of Narnia. Not the first set of novels that Lewis wrote. Lewis actually had appreciated the importance of of narratives before then. Think of his science fiction trilogy. But his Chronicles of Narnia, I think, really bring out very, very clearly both Lewis's own vision of faith and why he thought stories were so important. here are the points I'm going to make. Here's the first of them. You and I exist in a complex world. And as we live in that world, people will tell us stories of what we think this world is all about. One story is, there's no God, we just make this idea up because we're inadequate. And when we finally realize this, we kind of face up to reality and become atheists. Lewis bought that for a while, but then realized this just is too slick, too simple, too superficial. And Lewis makes the point, and we see this very, very clearly in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that we hear multiple stories about who we are and what this world is all about. And we have to make judgments about which of these is the most reliable. And if you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you will know this. There's a very, very interesting section in that novel where the children say, well, we've heard these different stories. I mean, maybe Lucy's mad. Maybe, they go through all kinds of possibilities. And the professor who owns the old house in the country, who may just be a literary reincarnation of Lewis himself, kind of gets them to think through how they would judge between competing stories. And that's what we're faced with. We are faced with multiple stories. One of those would be, look, we're the random outcome of a random process. We are meaningless. Another would be, we are the beloved children of a God who sent Christ to die for us. These are rather different. And they have quite different impacts in our understanding of who we are and why we matter. And Lewis's point is we have to face up to this fact. There are multiple stories. We need to be able to explain why one of those we think is right. So again, we think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And they have to ask which of these stories offers the best account of the world. Those of you who are scientists will immediately say, this sounds very much like inference to the best explanation in science, and it is. Lewis knew about that, but is using his own vocabulary to find a way of working out which is the best story. Now, I'll come back to that later, but I want to move on and look at this point, because I think this is probably one of the most interesting points. Lewis, as an atheist, thought, well, there's no God, no point to life, got to live it, let's do it, so what? Any of you who read his later works will know that is not what Lewis felt as a Christian. He really had this deep sense of who he was, this deep sense of purpose, this deep sense of belonging, of mattering. And of course, this all arises from the Christian narrative. And Lewis's point really is that our own personal narratives, which are unique to each of us and which really matter to each of us, are given a new sense of identity and significance when we become part of something bigger. In other words, we step into a bigger story and we can see we can play a role here, we can play a part here, we can move this bigger story on, and our own personal stories begin to develop significance and meaning because of what we're able to do. And so Lewis really is inviting us to think of faith as allowing ourselves to enter into this bigger story. Obviously, more needs to be said, but that is quite a helpful way of thinking. So again, you can see Lewis here really focusing on something very significant. He and Tolkien talked about this a lot. And Tolkien actually developed quite a sophisticated theology about why we tell stories. We are made in God's image, Genesis 1:27. And that means that we tell stories, we express this distinct identity. And in many ways, these stories echo the greater story of God. Lewis reflects that, but doesn't really make as much of the theological foundations as Tolkien did. But another point that Lewis makes, which I think is really helpful if you're a preacher, is this. Stories are very good at illustrating and helping people to understand theological concepts. Why is this important? In an essay called Christian Apologetics, written I think in 1945, Lewis makes the point there's a real danger that we kind of way present Christianity in terms of abstract concepts. And Lewis makes the point again and again and again, we have to explain, we have to apply these, we have to tell stories which bring these ideas to life. So let's look at the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. One of Lewis's most interesting stories, because there's no obvious antagonist in the story. It's really about a group of people growing in self-understanding because of quite a dangerous and perilous voyage. But in this story, Eustace Scrubb. Now, to an English native speaker, Eustace Scrubb sounds awful. It just sounds bad, and so immediately you think this guy is not very nice. And as you read about Eustace Scrubb, I'm afraid your impression is confirmed. That actually, Lewis does not like him at all. But what Lewis wants to do is to try and help us to think about the nature of sin. Because, sin is a very difficult idea. I mean, maybe some people here tonight who will agree with me that sin is really, really impossible to understand unless you have some kind of image or narrative to help you frame it. And what Lewis does here is, in effect, to portray Eustace Scrubb as someone who is taken over by greed. He's not saying greed equals sin. He's saying that in some ways, sin is like a force that takes over us, and we just can't break free from it. So he talks about Eustace Scrubb, in effect, becoming so greedy, in effect, he becomes a dragon. Now here, I am very pleased to tell you, Lewis is drawing on Nordic stories. He's drawing on the dragon Fafnir, and he's making the point that, in effect, what's happening to Eustace Scrubb is that he is not simply exhibiting, showing greed, he is becoming greed. In other words, it is who he is. He's been taken over by this, and he cannot break free from it. He's been taken captive by something, and he can't actually escape from it. And if you've read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you know there's this passage where Lewis vividly describes Eustace Scrubb trying to scratch himself to get rid of the dragon skin, and it won't come off. And he's reduced to despair. Those of your philosophers may think of Wittgenstein's very famous quote, "We were held captive by a picture." And the point that Wittgenstein is making simply is we very often find we're entrapped by a way of thinking, and we just can't break free from it. And we need someone to, in effect, say there is a better way, a better picture, which actually allows you to achieve liberation and fulfillment. And Lewis actually uses that idea, though not referencing Wittgenstein. But the key point here is that Lewis is perfectly aware that many theological ideas are really quite abstract, but telling a story brings them to life. And that, I think, is a very important point. There'll be some here tonight who are preachers. There'll be some who are thinking about Christianity. And I mean, basically, it's trying to get your head around this idea. Sin, not simply, it's not you're bad. It's much more you are trapped, you're ill, you're damaged, you're in a place where you can't get out of it by yourself. You need to be somewhere else, but you are not able to break free from where you are at the moment. And Lewis is trying to use a narrative to help us work out what sin is all about. So here, I think Lewis is really bringing out this idea that stories can be very helpful in developing our understanding of theological ideas. But there's another point I want to make, and it's this. I mentioned earlier that our culture tells stories. And these are very often quite complex stories. Very often, it's not a single story. The American sociologist Christian Smith makes the point that actually that there are so many stories about human nature, human identity in modern Western culture. It's really quite difficult to know which one we trust. And he makes the point that actually very often each of these stories reflects some deep anxiety about who we are. I think it's a very fair point. But the key point that Lewis is making is this. If people feel the need for a story which helps them to make sense of who they are and why they matter, then it's really important that Christianity shows it has a better story. I think that is a point that many writers have followed through on. Lewis makes this point in a sermon of 1941, and the point he's trying to make really is that so many popular presentations of Christianity are rationalist. Here are some very good arguments for believing Christianity is right. Now, neither Lewis nor I have any problem with that, but there's another way of doing it. There's a better way of doing it. And Lewis basically is arguing that we need to be able to tell a better story. To in fact be able to say, here is a story which seems to make more sense of who we are, which offers us a vision of our future, and which gives us, in effect, a conceptual space within which we can discover meaning and significance and purpose. And again, I think that is a really very important point. But let me go on now, because I want to look at an aspect of Lewis which I think is important, and that is the relationship between imagination and reason. Now again, when I was talking about Lewis shifting from atheism to Christianity, one of the points I made is that really Lewis felt that atheism was really quite rationalist. It was dependent on reasons. It didn't seem to engage his imagination or his emotions. In other words, if I can put it like this, it was highly selective in the aspects of his life that he actually considered to be really important. And one of the reasons that Lewis really made this massive change from atheism to Christianity was his realization that Christianity was able to engage the rational issues, but also engage the imagination and feelings. I think that is something well worth talking about. And Lewis, I think, here exhibits something which I think is really worth thinking about. And it's this. Lewis sees himself as someone who is trying to help us to see what he has seen. This is a point that Lewis brings out very clearly in a controversy of the late 1920s called the personalist heresy. The details are not important, but the key point Lewis is making is this. For Lewis, we have two options. What is a writer trying to do? Option number one, which Lewis thinks is wrong, is this. The writer is saying, I'm telling you what's right, agree with me. Option number two, which is Lewis's view, is that the writer is someone who says, look what I have seen. Can you see that? Do you find the same attraction as I do? And again, if you read the Chronicles of Narnia with that principle in mind, it makes a much bigger sense. Now, this quote from Lewis works in English. It may not work in Danish. What Lewis says is that the writer is not a spectacle who says, look at me, but rather a set of spectacles, like this, who says, look through me, look through me. In other words, I think I can help you to see something you've missed up to this point. And certainly, again, when I began to read Lewis, that's what I found. Lewis was enabling me to see things in a new way, and it really helped me, really excited me. So this, I think, is something really important. Lewis is saying that his own role is that of someone who wants us to see things in a Christian way and realize the quality and depth of this vision of reality. Now, some of you are saying, well, look, doesn't he give us some arguments as well? Well, he does. But if you like, that's lower down the scale. Lewis's big idea, which he felt was absent from atheism, was the idea of a big picture, a way of envisioning the world, a way of thinking about ourselves, which suddenly helps us to realize we're important, we matter, we have purpose, we're special. And then Lewis provides the reasons for thinking this is right afterwards. But he wants us to understand what difference this makes. Now, I think is a very important point. If you're a preacher, you'll probably say something like this. When I'm preaching something, I'll say, here are 3 topics I want to engage. Number 1, why do I think this is right? Number 2, how do I express this? And number 3, what difference does it make? Lewis majors on that third question. If this idea is right, what difference does it make? And for Lewis, Christianity just transforms our vision of ourselves and the world. It's really a very significant theme in his writings. So this is from one of Lewis's later writings, An Experiment in Criticism, written when he went to Cambridge. As I hinted, those of us who remained at Oxford just feel a little bit sad about that, but actually he still lived in Oxford, even though he went to Cambridge. But I'm going to read this to you slowly, but I want you to try and get the idea of what he's saying, because if you think he's right, he may be wrong, okay, but if you think he's right, then A, it gives you a reason to read Lewis, but B, it gives you a reason to read just about everybody interesting, because you realize they may help you to see things in a new way or to think things through. Here he goes. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others. Literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. In other words, I'm an individual. That matters enormously, but it limits me. I need some way of overcoming my limits. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself like the night sky in the Greek poem. I see with a myriad of 1,000 eyes, but it's still I who see. Here, as in worship, love, moral action, knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. It's dense, but I think you can see the point he's getting at. It means each of us remains ourselves. And yet by reading writers, maybe Lewis, maybe Tolkien, maybe other writers who you enjoy, you suddenly get a sense of, here's the way they see things. This helps me to see things as well. You probably know this, but Lewis did not visit Italy or Greece until the very late 1950s. He felt he didn't need to, because by reading classical Greek and Roman writers, he felt they had helped him to see these things. So it's very, very interesting. But the key point here is, my guess is you have writers who help you in various ways. Maybe they're spiritual writers, maybe they're political writers, whatever. And very often we read these people because they help us to focus our vision, to see things in a way that actually goes beyond what we could manage on our own. And that certainly is what Lewis is saying. And more importantly, the more people I talk to about Lewis, the more I realize this is why so many people read Lewis, because he gives them this new way of seeing things which they find helpful. And I have to say, I am one of those who have benefited from what Lewis has to say. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if we go back to Lewis in the 1920s, Lewis is still an atheist, but he's an atheist in a rather nominal sense. He's saying, look, this may be right, but actually it doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't excite me. It doesn't seem to make any difference. And Lewis regularly expresses the idea in his letters of the 1920s that atheism seemed to be a bit impoverished and impoverishing. And he uses words like thin or superficial to describe the account of atheism that he encountered. Let me go back. Something's happened there. And he really felt there was a need for some way of engaging our feelings, our imagination, our emotions. And this is one of the aspect of Lewis that really surprises people, because many people think of Lewis as kind of as someone who gives us some rational arguments for Christianity. He does. I disagree on that. But actually he's doing something else, and maybe something more interesting. What he is doing is actually engaging the way we feel. He's engaging our emotions. And by doing so, he's acknowledging, first of all, these exist, and secondly, that they might be rather important. And this is, as probably many of you will know, the basis of his argument for desire, which isn't really an argument. It's much more a kind of a way of saying, look at this big picture, and you can see how it makes sense of our feelings. Why are they there? What are they there for? And it's really one of these points that Lewis makes, not really a rational argument, but more a sense that this is giving us a way of seeing things which really seems to engage our feelings and help us make sense of where they're pointing. And Lewis had a very strong sense, there was a deep, that most human beings have a deep sense of longing for something undefinable sometimes, that really nothing in this world seems able to satisfy. And Lewis's point is this: where does this come from, and what does it mean? It might mean nothing. Lewis is absolutely clear about that. But on the other hand, most of us find our feelings actually quite significant. What do these things mean? And so Lewis basically, something's happened there, basically argues that what we have here is this deep sense of a feeling which nothing that we know is able to satisfy. How do we make sense of it? Well, it might mean nothing at all. But, and here's the key point, Lewis is saying, if you look at this feeling through a Christian lens, through a Christian big picture, then in effect it becomes, if you like, God speaking to us. God saying, there's something you're missing. And this feeling has its origins in God, but also its goal in God. And what Lewis is doing here is in effect reworking a very famous prayer of Augustine of Hippo from the 5th century, which many of you will know. It's in the very first paragraph of his book, The Confessions. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. Now, obviously, I could say a lot more about C.S. Lewis, but I really feel it's very important to let you direct the conversation. So in a moment, I'm going to wrap up and give you the chance to direct the conversation in any way you like. But I think a key point to understand is this. One of the reasons that C.S. Lewis is read by so many people is that when you read him, you have a sense that he knows two worlds. He knows an atheist world. He knows a Christian world. And he's able to try and capture what they're like and why he made a transition. And I think it is really very important. For many, you probably have read many Christian writers who just give you arguments and don't show any sense of intellectual empathy or anything like that. Lewis is someone who knew where he'd come from and knew why he'd moved, and in effect is able to speak to other people who are in a very similar position. That's one of the reasons he's so interesting. He spoke to me. I'm sure he speaks to many others as well. But listen, it's time for me to wrap up, and we're now going to give you the floor. So I'm very, very happy to respond to any questions you would like to raise about what I've said or things you feel I ought to have talked about. And I'd be delighted to do that. So I'm going to let you direct the conversation for the remainder of this evening. So.
Yes. Before the Q&A sessions, we will have a 20-minute break. So about 10 to 9, we will convene here again. During the break, you can buy Danish translations of C.S. Lewis' books. For example, his own self-biography has just been translated into Danish. And then I want to say that after the break, during the Q&A, if you're not, we will have a runner microphone, so you can ask questions through this microphone. But we'll also have the possibility of asking questions online. We have a feed, online feed. You can find it through the event page on Facebook. And then you can ask your questions or write your questions in the chat. and then we will take some of those questions during the Q&A sessions. Yes, but thank you for that inspiring talk, Professor McGrath. And now we'll have a break.
Thank you.
Yes. Please come in and sit down. We are going to continue now with the Q&A. And I want to start by repeating myself and explaining about the Q&A. So we have a runner microphone, this microphone, which Andreas will go around with. So if you want to pose a question, then put your hands up and get his attention. And he'll come and hand you the microphone. And when you get the chance to pose your question, then say your name and pose your question. And please try to make it short and concise. Then you can also pose questions online. You can find the streaming of this event through the Facebook event, where you can find a link, and then you can post your questions in the chat. And then we have another Andreas down here, and he will post your question if it's chosen. Yeah. So, yes. I think we'll begin with a question from online.
All right.
And
so we have a question from online, Alister. How do we tell a better story when many modern-day atheists do hold to moral realism and objective meaning to life and so on? The thin atheism of the early Lewis was quite different from that.
Well, thank you, online. I think this is a very good question. One of the best answers to this question is given by G.K. Chesterton rather than C.S. Lewis, but Lewis echoes this. So I'm going to give you the G.K. Chesterton version. What Chesterton says is, in fact, look, atheism is able to offer us moral values and various things like that. But there are 2 points that Chesterton feels need to be looked at very closely. Number one, what do these actually rest upon? And Chesterton's making the point that unless you have a transcendent foundation that is not of our making, then in fact we're simply looking at human inventions. And the minute you say, look, these have a transcendent ground, in other words, they are something that are independent of us, they are valid despite us, they are not our creations, they're something we've discovered, you're in effect moving in a Christian direction without really being open about that. That's the first point he makes. The second point that Chesterton makes is really interesting, and it's this. He says that in many ways what atheism is able to do is offer us a series of values, which very often are simply assertions of ideas rather than rigorously grounded in some vision of the way the world is. But what Chesterton argues is that actually Christianity offers you a coordinated framework within which these values are naturally held together. I think that is quite an important point. So overall, the point that Lewis makes, basing himself on Chesterton, but taking this in a slightly different direction, would be something like this. Nobody is saying that atheism does not have moral values. Let's be quite clear about that. The question is, on what do those moral values rest? Because if there's something that we've constructed, then they are likely to reflect peer groups, vested interests. They're likely to reflect the privileging narratives of certain social groups rather than other social groups. In other words, they are human inventions which very clearly betray their human origins. And Lewis's argument is that, in effect, what Christianity does is to give you a set of moral values which are not something we've created, but rather something that we've been entrusted with, and we're asked to kind of way explore these and live them out, and actually make them come to life in our lives. Now, it's a very good question. These are longer answers than that, but I think you can see the basic line of thought I'm developing. Thank you very much, online.
Hello, I'm Alexander. I was wondering what Lewis thought about the lake of fire, damnation. I've read some of his books, but I don't remember him writing about that. I think he did probably, but what view did he hold of damnation? Did he hold the traditional view, or?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Lewis, if I can put it like this, articulates a vision of the Christian faith, which many people find profoundly attractive. But there are two criticisms that are very often made of it, and I will tell you what they are and see if this resonates with what you've just been saying. Number one, that actually, because Lewis is trying very, very hard to speak to all Christians, his idea of mere Christianity is really a sort of consensual Christianity. He doesn't want to get involved in denominational disputes. It means that actually some issues that are really important don't get discussed because they are denominationally sensitive. And the other thing is that, of course, Lewis pardon me, does tend to omit a lot of ideas that many people would think are important. You've mentioned one, and he doesn't really talk about that very much. Now, you could read that into him. You could read that into The Last Battle. You could read that into, I think, parts of Mere Christianity. But I have the impression that Lewis doesn't really see these as having quite the same importance, for example, as a doctrine of the Incarnation or a doctrine of the Trinity. So that, I think, will be a problem for some people for Lewis. Then we have to say, does Lewis's agenda actually explain this? Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that in many ways what Lewis is saying is, what I want to try and do is to help people, in effect, explore Christianity by giving them a sense of what it's all about. And that means he doesn't really give them a total account of what Christianity is. He gives a sort of a slightly selective approach. And that has its merits, but it does involve leaving quite a lot out. So my own feeling is that Lewis is offering us, if I can put it like this, a shared, consensual, but partial vision of Christianity, and is inviting us to discover the rest for ourselves. Certainly, there are aspects of Lewis's analysis which many people feel just leaves too much out. Unfortunately, I can't ask Lewis himself why he didn't talk about this. My guess is it's because he has this sort of ecumenical vision and really wants people to explore this. But I don't really know. But you're right, these things just aren't there.
Yes, so another question from online. How did C.S. Lewis balance, on the one side, his personal commitment to Christ, and on the other, being intellectually open to other new, better stories?
Yes, this is a very good question. In fact, I have to say this is a question I've had to wrestle with myself. So I'm going to talk about C.S. Lewis, because I think that's what the questioner online wants me to do. So it is an important question, and there'll be many Christian academics in this audience who will probably say, I recognize that question. Let's talk about that. What Lewis is trying to do, and again, I touched on this a little bit in response to the previous question, is to in effect, help fellow academics take Christianity seriously. And he realizes he cannot do that by a simple repetition of the creeds. He's got to find some way of drawing them in and enabling them to explore things. And inevitably, that means that it's only a partial exploration. I think what Lewis is doing, if I could use a very familiar image, is opening a door and saying, look what's through there. Off you go, explore. You know, it's really like that, but he doesn't really go into the detail you and I might expect, except at certain points which resonate with his own academic interests. Now, there's something we haven't really talked about, but many of you will probably have noticed this. When I talked about narratives, when I talked about experience, when I talked about imagination, you know, if you are a scholar of literature and language, you're going to be talking about these things anyway. In other words, it's almost as if Lewis is academically positioned, if I can put it like that, to really be able to engage with those questions from the standpoint of someone who knows about imagination, who knows about the use of language, and he's read Spencer's Language of Poetry and knows how to do things with it. So my own feeling is that what Lewis is doing is not necessarily making his approach to Christianity dependent on any particular scholarly theory, but rather is using his own toolkit based on literature and language and saying this is something that can be used and applied to the Christian faith. But the question being posed is actually quite a good one, because there are points at which Lewis, as an academic, has to make judgments about this theory rather than that theory. And I think the online question is probably asking, how does Lewis actually do that? And I think it is an important question, because Lewis, as a professor at Cambridge in particular, was involved in a number of debates about what literature is all about, what we mean by the Renaissance, and all these debates were going on, and actually some of them are reflected in Lewis's novels. But again, what I see is Lewis very often, if I can put it like this, presenting episodes or points about these debates rather than the debates themselves. So I think really, if anybody's interested in discovering Lewis's scholarly persona, in other words, trying to figure out what he thought about the great literary debates of the time, you won't find those really in his popular works about Christianity. You'll have to look at the more academic works, mostly published by Cambridge University Press. And one of them I mentioned earlier this evening was, of course, An Experiment in Criticism, where Lewis is actually intervening in a major debate about the involvement of the reader in the text, which is a major debate back then and still is today. And in fact, the quote I gave you is really beginning to open up that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, it's loud. Regarding damnation, you just said that C.S. Lewis didn't have much thought about damnation, but then I guess you have to explain what is the Great Divorce about then, if it's not about C.S. Lewis's thoughts on damnation.
Thank you. I didn't entirely hear the word you were saying. It came across to me as the nation. Did you say damnation? No, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, the Great Divorce is really quite interesting in that respect, because it's what Lewis is thought to be doing in that work is exploring what he presents to us is a medieval way of thinking about this question. And what he's doing is he's presenting this medieval way of thinking about this question and then using that as a framework for discussion of that. In other words, he's not necessarily saying, I think that's right. He's saying, let's just work this framework and see where it takes us. So there's always this slight degree of ambiguity. Is Lewis saying, I think this, or is Lewis saying, let's explore this and see where it takes us? But certainly you're right. I mean, it does help us understand in some ways. I think that many of us really like his description of a typical English liberal bishop, who is very well sketched, I have to say. I very often find myself wondering who he has in mind. So I think that there are questions there. So I think the question there simply is Lewis saying, that's what I think, or that's what I'm exploring? I think it's probably what he thinks, but I think he's also really exploring the idea just to see where it takes him. Thank you.
Yes, so a question from Christopher. The world has always known bigger stories. The Greek gods or the Nordic gods have stories. I could join my forefathers as a warrior in Valhalla. Why is the story of Jesus a better or more truthful story?
I think Lewis and Tolkien both answer this question, and so I think it is really a very good question. If you look at the great myths of Nordic mythology or indeed Anglo-Saxon mythology, they're very often about warriors, male warriors, who in effect triumph over their foes, and it's very violent. And Lewis, of course, as a scholar of English literature, would know the Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood. Now, I imagine none of you know this, but I'll just tell you what it is. It's a poem about the cross. And Christ is depicted as triumphant, not because he defeats the cross, but because he kind of way submits to it, and in doing so enables God's will to be done. And if you like, it's almost like a counter-narrative to the heroic narrative of Nordic and Anglo-Saxon mythology. So I think that that's going on there. But nevertheless, I mean, there are many points in both Tolkien and Lewis where you can see clear echoes of this idea of personal combat, noble combat. And it's really interesting because we know that Lewis and Tolkien talked about this quite a lot. And both of them fought in the First World War. And both of them expressed the alienating idea of someone killing you from, 6 kilometers away. They just fired a shell, blew up. They never got to see you. You never got to see them. And so there's a sense in which, if you look at Tolkien and to some extent Lewis, particularly in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Last Battle, there's this sense that battle is noble because you get to see the people you're fighting. So it's quite interesting. I personally don't quite agree with it, but I know many of my friends like it, so I need to tell you about it, while at the same time saying this isn't really something I like, but I know that many of my friends find this a very attractive aspect of both Lewis and Tolkien. And indeed, if you talk to people who enjoy watching the Peter Jackson movies of The Lord of the Rings, very often they'll say it's the battle scenes, it's all about heroism, that sort of thing. And part of me says, well, yes it is, but we need to say more than this. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was really good. It might be a short question, but I was just quite intrigued by what you said about George Herbert being potentially like an inspiration or an influence. I was just wondering if you could see that somewhere in Lewis's work, like references or inspirations.
Well, you can certainly see it in Lewis's big writing in the Oxford History of English Literature, excluding drama, where he does talk quite a lot about Herbert. But my own feeling is that Surprised by Joy actually gives you quite a lot of clues. That actually Lewis really likes John Donne, Thomas Traherne, George Herbert. And the reason he gives for this is that they seem able to capture and represent the complexity of human existence. It's not good, not bad. It's kind of a very complex thing. And Lewis just said, look, these guys have found a worldview which is capable of capturing this complexity. So when you read them, you think these guys understand it. They know that this is complicated, and they're actually working with something which you feel is a real account of what human beings do when they think about things. But interestingly, Lewis identifies, in particular, George Herbert as a cause of his own conversion. And the reason for this is precisely what I've mentioned. Lewis says the Christian mythology, that was the word he used at the time, back in the 20s, seemed to saturate Herbert's writings, and yet it seemed to yield such a satisfying account of human nature. And you can see him saying, where is this going to take me? And then Lewis, a few sentences later, says, a good atheist has to be very careful about what he reads, because there are traps everywhere. And I think George Herbert is one of those traps. Thank you.
Another question from online. Rasmus asked, isn't building acceptance of a worldview on stories fragile?
I have to say that again.
So isn't it fragile to build your worldview on stories?
Fragile.
Fragile.
Thank you. Yes, I think the answer is that clearly what we're talking about here is the issue of faith. You're not talking about something that is demonstrably and compellingly true. What you're saying is here's something that's imaginatively really attractive and actually conveys intellectual truth, and you say, this actually makes sense. And it's one of those things where Lewis talks about, there's several points, which is, what is it that makes you think this is right? And one of the things that Lewis looks for is imaginative traction. In other words, its ability to capture your imagination. And I think that's very important. And then also the outcome. Does this prove the basis of a meaningful life? And certainly what Lewis is saying is that in his experience, this actually proved to be the case. So what is interesting here is, as an undergraduate, Lewis studied philosophy. But actually, as you read Lewis, you don't see philosophy being used very much, apart from kind of we're putting down very simplistic philosophical arguments against God, which Lewis does very well. But he almost saying that to engage the really deep questions of human existence, what Karl Popper calls ultimate questions, actually the kind of Oxford philosophy isn't really all that much use. You need something deeper. And that's why Lewis says that literature is so important, because these are people who have discovered something, who have really come to realize that something is true, not just in the sense of being notionally correct, but of being existentially transformative. And so that's what Lewis is really getting at. For Lewis, actually, I'm overstating slightly, so I must make this clear. Lewis is almost saying the capacity of a worldview to transform is an indicator, not a proof of its importance. So that's a very important idea. Lewis is saying it's not just true, it's real. I mean, lots of things you can think of that are true, like 2 and 2 make 4, so what? But if something is real, it really is able to transform life and ground it. And that's really one of the things that Lewis is getting at. Thank you.
Hi. My question is, do you know whether Lewis believed in the stories from the Bible as true events or as stories, just like Narnia? Yeah, as stories just trying to explain how great God is.
I think that Lewis was very impressed by the role of biblical narratives. So, in other words, the use of the genre of narratives in Scripture was very important for him. He felt that that legitimated its use in his own writings. Now, your question is whether that really means that Lewis, in effect, took what we might call a realistic view towards those narratives. And Lewis, I think, on the whole, is saying that with the historical narratives, these are real things that happened. His key point, though, would be that they have to be interpreted if we're going to really see what their importance is. So what Lewis is really trying to tease out here is that it's not enough to tell a story, you have to be able to explain what it means. That's one point. And then Lewis does at several points talk about the New Testament parables, and particularly Christ's parables of the kingdom. And Lewis, at one point, I think, does reflect on whether the force of these parables depends upon their being historically true. In other words, was there really a son who went into a distant land and came back humiliated and ran to his father and asked for forgiveness? And I think Lewis's argument is that actually the story does not need to have a historical foundation to make its spiritual point, although I would say there almost certainly is a historical foundation to it. So Lewis, I think, is really bringing out the importance of narrative, but is actually not always committing himself to its absolute historicity. I'm not for one moment saying that Lewis denies its historicity. It's that when you read him, you have the impression it's the narrative itself that seems to be grabbing his attention. And if you look at his reflections on the Psalms, he does seem to be saying it's almost as if it's not so much the historical event, it's the way in which the psalmist uses historical events that is what's really important. So I'm afraid on this question I have to be a little bit equivocal, because I think Lewis himself is equivocal on that point. But it's a good question to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the inspirational talk, Professor McGrath. 2 questions, I think. First, you mentioned some of the arguments that make sense for Lewis to convert from atheism to Christianity, but for example, the problem of evil in an evil world with a good God. Could you just please unfold it just a bit from his point of view, experience in the First world war, and I think it's in our world where in Denmark we don't experience too much evil in that sense of a war, but we have the Ukrainian war and we have personal histories challenged with evil in our own lives. So could you, from his perspective, what are the good arguments for a good God in a world that seems to be evil? One second, a better narrative, or what you just said, a more satisfying account of, for example, being a human. I have a confirmation class or two and some serious discussions, not really to gain ammunition. I think I've got that, but still, how could you say that, for example, being a meaningless bundle of atoms, persons like we are with a limited lifespan, is a worse or better story of being a person than being a flawed human being, tainted by sin, and apparently with a risk of being damned for eternity? I mean, how's the one a better story than the other?
Thank you. Well, I mean, these are two quite big questions, but I'm going to try and answer them, because I think many of you will probably be very pleased if I do that, because I think they're both good. On suffering, I mean, Lewis deals with this at a number of points, obviously in the problem of pain, although that, I think, offers us a very intellectualized approach to suffering, and of course in Grief Observed, which is very much a sort of personal, emotional reaction followed by theological reflection, elicited by the death of his wife. But he also actually talks about this in his letters around the time of the First World War. So I think the point that Lewis realized was something like this. I have this deep intuition that suffering, whether it is in a human life caused by illness or caused by warfare, is wrong. Is this just an intuition, my personal judgment, or does this rest on something objective? In other words, is this not just me saying, this is a matter of taste for me, that I think this is unpleasant or bad or evil, or do I have grounds for saying this is actually wrong or evil? And Lewis's point, which he made in that quote I gave you from the 1920s, is really that in order to use the language of morality, this is wrong, you need a much stronger framework than atheism is able to give you. You may be able to say, I feel that this is wrong, or I feel that this is unjust. But the stronger statement is simply not true. You might think of Alex Rosenberg's book on atheism and illusions, which came out in 2011, which is a very interesting book, because in effect, what he does there as an atheist is say, we will only take scientific perspectives on things. In other words, we will only make judgments that are grounded in the natural sciences. And of course, one of the first things he says we can talk about then is moral judgments. Suffering happens, yeah, that's right. But the moral framework just isn't there. We need a moral framework from somewhere. And Lewis's point really is that if we begin to bring that moral framework in, well, we have to account for where it comes from, and that immediately talks about there being something beyond our own referential scheme to be able to do that. So Lewis would say that in one sense, our feeling of outrage at suffering is actually quite significant, because it's pointing to this deeper intuition that this is not the way things are meant to be. So that's the first point. The second point is that when you read The Problem of Pain, I mean, it's quite a good book, but you do have this terrible feeling that Lewis is intellectualizing the problem of pain and not really doing justice to its emotional impact, its existential impact. And a lot of people would say, it's a bit like solving a crossword puzzle. It's treated as almost being a purely intellectual riddle. And in recent years, there's been an added layer of criticism from people like J.K.A. Smith, who would say this represents a kind of, he calls it epistemic Pelagianism. In other words, the idea that human reason is able to uncover everything. And therefore, we ought to be able to figure out what suffering actually is for. And what I find interesting about Lewis, and this doesn't really answer your question, but it does, I think, said in context, is this idea that recognizing that Christ suffers, in fact, makes it easier for us to bear this, but doesn't necessarily explain it. And that's a line of thought which needs a lot of unpacking, and I'm not going to have enough time to do it. But what I will say is that it's there in one form in the problem of pain, in a different form in grief observed. And the second form, I think, is more persuasive, but it's not compelling. It's, if you like, it's something you can very helpfully bring to thinking about this, but it's not something that's going to absolutely resolve it. Which brings us on to the idea of a better story, and what criterion is Lewis using to elucidate the idea of better. I think what Lewis is really getting at here is what we might call an explanatory success, or an explanatory virtue, and an interpretive virtue. Now, there's two things both there in scientific theorizing, and Lewis is really saying that you have to have some way of saying this story is able to help us make sense of things, but also to interpret things that are happening and see them in certain ways. And again, suffering might be an example of that. So Lewis's shorthand, a better story, basically needs an awful lot of unpacking, and between you and me, I'm not sure he actually does that unpacking, unfortunately. The sermon in which he used that phrase dates from 1941. He died in 1963, and I'm not really sure I see him unpacking that in any detail. So what I'm doing is telling you what I think he means by that. But again, it's not really, I don't think he really helps us here. But it does, I think, give us something to work with, to think about how we can try and show that Christianity does narrate something which actually has the capacity to engage the imagination, feelings, and so on. But obviously, there's an awful lot more needs to be said. Thank you.
Yes. So Jonathan asks why Lewis converted to Anglicanism and not Catholicism. Yeah, because he was very influenced by Catholic intellectuals such as Chesterton and Tolkien. So did he have any Anglican? Yeah.
Well, let me tell you what I think. The reason I'm phrasing like this is because nobody really knows. But I will tell you what my view is. I speak as an Anglican. I often ask myself, what would have happened if C.S. Lewis, instead of going to university in Oxford, went to university in Scotland, where you have a very different ecclesiastical situation? Now, the reason I'm asking this question is not trivial, because in his book, The Screwtape Letters, there's one bit where Lewis sets out what I would describe as a theology of place. What I mean by that is you belong to the local ecclesiastical community as an expression of who you are. And it helps to understand why Lewis began to go to chapel in Magdalen College and began to go to church in Headington, because he felt this was the right way of expressing it. But of course, the parish model in England is primarily Anglican. If he'd gone to Scotland, it would have been Church of Scotland. What would have happened then? Nobody knows. We can't do that experiment. But certainly there were people like Tolkien who would say, look, you ought to really think about Catholicism, although he didn't press them very hard on that point, I have to say. In fact, I think that actually Tolkien and Lewis actually, in their interaction, really sharpened each other up. So I think that perhaps they were quite happy to be a Catholic and an Anglican and not really worry about this. But I think the answer is that Lewis was an Anglican as a matter of historical contingency, not theological reflection. But that's me. Others would disagree. They would look at his analysis of poets like John Donne, Thomas Traherne, and George Herbert and say, look, can't you see these guys are articulating an Anglican theology, and look what they're doing with it. So, you know, I would have to defend myself, but that's my hunch, okay?
Yes, unfortunately, we have to bring the Q&A to a close, so let's give an applause for Professor McGrath.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, thank you to all of you for coming here. Before we let you go, I would like to make a bit of advertisement. So if you're interested in more from the Center for Christian Apologetics, you can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, apologetik.dk. We also have some more events. Tomorrow there's a theme day on narrative apologetics here from 9 to 14. And the sign-up is already long closed, but if you want to attend, then just show up and we'll find out something with the payment. If you want something on science and God, then go to Randers tomorrow, where McGrath will give another talk. You can find it online. Just Google your way through it. Yes. Then in October we have a series of talks on the certain uncertain faith. Yes, we have a poster. It's also up here somewhere. You can find it through our website. You're very welcome to attend. We also have a research network called Dianoia, convening the 28th of October. So if you're interested in really delving deep into apologetics issues, then come ask me about it. Yes. And I'm also supposed to say that the McGrath talk has been recorded, so you can find it online later if you're interested.
Ja, det har været en sand fornøjelse at være vært for CKA's arrangement. Thank you so much for coming here, McGrath. Thank you for your insights on C.S. Lewis and your way of answering our questions. Det jeg skal sige herfra, det er, at bogsalget det er stadig åbent, så man har stadig lige mulighed for at nappe en sidste bog. Jeg er løbet tør for sodavand, og jeg beklager til alle dem, der løb forgæves derud. Jeg beklager meget for det. Hvis du ellers bare lige har brug for lige at sidde og hygge lidt, så er du velkommen. Vi begynder lige så stille at rydde op, og det skal du ikke tage dig af. På et eller andet tidspunkt kan det være, at vi låser dørene, så kan det godt være, at du skal gå med ud. Men ellers så skal jeg jo sige, at hvis du har brug for eller lyst til at prøve en festlig, uhøjtidelig og nutidig gudstjeneste, så kan du bare komme tilbage her i det her lille lokale på søndag kl. 10 eller kl. 12.30. Og der er selvfølgelig også bare mulighed for at komme og prøve det af for første gang. And if you're an English-speaking person and you didn't understand that, I just invited people to come join church at Sunday 10 or 12:30, and there's translation for you as well. Kan I have en rigtig dejlig aften. Tak fordi I kom.